Chapter 1. The Whispered Rumor. The night in Mordheim was like any other, thick with fog, the shadows drawn long and deep. The city seemed to breathe its own foul air, a dark pulse thrumming beneath the rubble. But tonight there was something else. Whispers on the wind, faint and elusive, a thread of rumor twisting through the ruins like a ghost. I first heard it in the broken cathedral on the eastern edge of the city, a place desecrated by time and rot. A passing word among the scavengers, hushed as if saying it too loudly would summon something far worse than the city's usual horrors. They spoke of an artifact, a relic hidden deep within a forgotten cathedral. The relic of redemption, they called it, a fabled object that could strip away the curse of vampirism, restoring any vampire back to mortal flesh. I almost laughed when I first heard it. I have been undead for centuries, and in all that time I have heard countless tales of cures for our kind. They are always just beyond reach, nothing more than wishful thinking for those who cannot accept the darkness they've embraced. Yet something about this story lingered. A relic in Mordheim, hidden from prying eyes, able to grant freedom, or perhaps something even more powerful. It was absurd, of course, and yet I couldn't shake the thought of it. It whispered to me like a seductress in the dark, tempting me with a possibility I had long since discarded. For centuries, I have wielded my strength as a vampire with pride. I've carved my way through kingdoms, my fangs leaving a trail of blood and fear. Mortals tremble before me, and the night bends to my will. But a relic like this, an object of such rumored power, what could I become with it in my hands? If I controlled it, would it give me dominion over other vampires? Or perhaps a chance at something I had forgotten, mortality? The thought gnawed at me, churning like a dark river under my skin. I told myself it was foolish, a distraction from the real dangers that lurked in Mordheim. And yet, I could not let it go. Frich, came a voice from the shadows, breaking my thoughts. I turned to see Karl, my loyal companion, emerging from the darkness, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His face was worn, scarred from battles long past, yet his eyes held a sharp glint of purpose. "They're talking about it everywhere," he said, his voice low. "This relic, even the other vampires are whispering its name." I studied him for a moment, taking in the way he spoke of it, the faint tension in his jaw. Karl had always been steady, unyielding, a man driven by survival rather than ambition. But tonight there was something different about him. A flicker of interest, a spark I hadn't seen before. "And what does this relic mean to you, Karl?" I asked, my voice as smooth as the blade at my side. "You're not one of us. It wouldn't cure your humanity." Karl met my gaze, unflinching. "It may not cure me, but it's not every day you hear of something that can change the nature of a vampire. Imagine what it could do for you, Frich, for us." There it was. The faintest hint of something else. Not loyalty, not the pragmatism I had come to expect from him, but ambition. It lingered in his voice, just a whisper, but it was enough to set my instincts on edge. "And what is it that you want from this, Karl?" I asked, my eyes narrowing. "Is there something you're not telling me?" He hesitated, a shadow flickering across his face before he shook his head. "I serve you, Frich. You know that. But if this relic exists, if it really has the power they say, don't you think it's worth finding?" I held his gaze, searching his expression for any sign of deception. Karl had been by my side for years, had bled for me, fought with me, saved my life more times than I cared to count. But Mordheim changes people. I knew that well. It draws out their darkest desires, their deepest ambitions, until they are no longer recognizable, even to themselves. Still, I could not deny the pull of the relic, the temptation that gnawed at my mind. Was it a chance to free myself from this cursed existence? Or merely a weapon to bend others to my will? I did not yet know, but the uncertainty only made the desire sharper. I turned back to the shadows, letting the silence stretch between us. "Very well," I said at last. We will find this relic. But remember this, Karl, our paths may be aligned, but do not think for a moment that you can deceive me." Karl nodded, his face betraying nothing. "Understood." With that, we began our descent into the heart of Mordheim, the city's darkness closing in around us. The rumors had set the stakes high. Every vampire in Mordheim would be hunting for this relic, drawn by the same whispers that now guided my steps. They would kill to possess it, to wield its power. I had no doubt that I would encounter old rivals and new threats alike. But as I walked, a thought lingered at the edge of my mind, gnawing at me. Was I doing this out of a desire for freedom, redemption? Or was it simply another pursuit of power, a chance to assert my dominance over all who dared challenge me? The answer eluded me, but the question itself only deepened my resolve. As we moved deeper into Mordheim's labyrinth, I felt the weight of my decision pressing down on me, heavy as a shroud. Whatever the truth of the relic, whatever its purpose, I knew one thing for certain: I would claim it, or die trying. Chapter 2. Gathering Allies. The morning sun was barely a pale smear. Across the sky, as I mounted my horse and set out, the taste of yesterday's failure still bitter in my mouth. It felt like the whole of the Border Princes was deaf to reason, blind to the green tide rising against them. But I would try again, even if it meant hearing every arrogant excuse and facing every scoff of defiance. My first stop was Castle Varhold, a fortress that had withstood countless skirmishes and survived under the iron-fisted rule of Lord Oswin. As I approached the high walls, the guard's eyes narrowed, and I felt the familiar scrutiny of suspicion. A stranger asking to parley was a rarity, and I knew Oswin would meet my presence with equal suspicion. I was led to the great hall, where Oswin reclined on his throne with a dismissive wave as I approached. I wasted no time, my words precise and urgent. Lord Oswin the Waaga, led by Grook, is no ordinary orc raid. They're moving swiftly, leveling villages, and slaughtering every soul they find. We need to unite, or the Border Princes will fall. Oswin sneered, reclining lazily. An orc invasion, is it? Tell me, General, when have we not faced orcs on our borders? You come here with wild tales and want my men, my resources, to be squandered for your war. It's not my war, I snapped, unable to hide my frustration. If we don't rally now, your keep, your lands will be next. Grook's Wag is tearing through everything in its path, and it won't stop here. Oswin's laughter was sharp and cold. You overestimate the orcs, Alaric. I have walls, steel, and men. Let them come. They'll break upon my defenses as they always have. As for unity, I do not bleed for the weaknesses of others. The conversation ended as I'd expected, with Oswin dismissing me like an insect, leaving me simmering with anger as I rode away. His arrogance was not unique. Each lord I encountered thought only of their own survival, their own holdfast, and their own power. My next destination was Greystone Keep, ruled by Lady Helena. She was known for her wit and cunning, and I clung to the hope that reason might appeal to her. Helena received me in a small study, her gaze cold and calculating as I relayed the growing threat of Grook and the devastation I had already seen. An alliance, you say? She leaned forward, her expression a mixture of amusement and skepticism. And who would lead this little coalition, Alaric? You, perhaps? To what end? So that the Border Princes can unite under a single banner and weaken all the rest of us. This isn't about control, Helena, I argued, my voice firm. It's survival. If we don't stand together, we will be nothing more than corpses rotting in Grook's wake. Your people, your lands will burn as quickly as any other. She leaned back, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Perhaps. But should we survive this, who's to say you won't seize control of what's left? I bit back a retort, realizing that nothing I said could penetrate the cynicism that had calcified around her heart. I had encountered too much of it already. These lords saw every alliance as a threat, every offer of aid as an attempt to rob them of power. And so, with gritted teeth, I took my leave, one more failure adding weight to the despair growing in my gut. As the day wore on, I found myself outside the gates of yet another stronghold, the last on my list. The keep loomed ahead, tall and dark against the sky, its banners fluttering with the colors of Prince Gerard, a man I knew all too well. Gerard was ambitious, cunning, and ruthless, and any attempt to rally him would be an exercise in frustration. But I had no choice. I was losing ground, losing time. And if anyone held sway in the Border Princes, it was Gerard. Inside the keep, Gerard received me with a smug smile, his demeanor that of a lord thoroughly in control. He was dressed in fine robes, his every gesture calculated. I could see the mirth in his eyes as he sized me up, the weight of my desperation not lost on him. "Ah, General Relic," he greeted, his voice oozing false politeness. "What brings the great defender of the Border Princes to my hall? Surely this must be something dire." "You know exactly why I'm here," I replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Grook's Wa is closing in. The Border Princes are on the brink, Gerard. We need to form a coalition, or we're all dead." Gerard laughed, a deep, mocking sound. "You want my men, my resources, my loyalty to defend the very rivals who would gladly seize my lands given the chance." He shook his head, feigning disappointment. "Tell me, Alaric, what do I stand to gain?" "Survival," I spat, anger flaring. "Do you think Grook will respect your walls, your soldiers? He'll sweep through here, burning everything. We need to pool our resources to hold them off." Gerard smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only the glint of calculation. "Grook may indeed be a threat," he mused, rubbing his chin. "But he could also be an opportunity, a means to thin out my rivals. If the Waha sweeps through, the land will be ripe for the taking, once the dust settles." I felt a surge of disgust. "You would use this madness as an advantage. These are lives, Gerard, not just pawns for you to gamble with." He shrugged, unimpressed. "That's the nature of power, Alaric. You of all people should know that. And when Grook has passed through, I will be stronger for it." I stared at him, the words caught in my throat. No plea, no argument would change his mind. To him, Grook was just another tool, a wild animal he thought he could tame. He had no understanding of the ruin, the utter chaos that would follow. But I couldn't let go. I took a step forward, swallowing my pride. "Please, Gerard. I've seen what he's done to the villages in the south. There won't be anything left if he gets through. Join me, and I swear on my life, I'll answer for any losses you suffer. Just help us stop him." Gerard looked at me, clearly relishing the sight of a desperate man. He paused, feigning deep thought, before finally answering. "I will consider it, but at a price. Should we prevail, my holdings will extend to Greystone and Varhold. I want their lands, their titles." "Those are not mine to give," I answered, barely keeping my anger in check. "And you know that." "Then there is no deal," he said simply, turning away. I stood there, feeling the weight of defeat settle over me, knowing that my pleas had fallen on deaf ears, that these lords would do nothing until Grook himself was at their gates. Each one cared only for their own power, their own land. None would unite against this threat. As I rode back, the sky had darkened, the first stars pricking the dusk, and a deep sense of futility gnawed at me. I had given everything, spoken every word I could think of to sway them, but it wasn't enough. The Border Princes, each wrapped in their castles and their petty feuds, would not lift a finger to save one another. And Grook was coming, unstoppable as a storm, and we were still divided, fractured, and vulnerable. I felt my resolve harden into something colder. I would stand against the orcs, alone if I had to, with whatever men I could muster. For those who had lost their homes, who had watched their lives torn apart, I would make a stand. But I knew, deep down, that even if I fought until my last breath, it would never be enough. Chapter 3. The First Test. The cathedral loomed before us, an ominous silhouette against the starlit sky. Its walls were cracked and broken, half consumed by creeping vines and decay, yet it held an ancient grandeur. Even in ruin, the structure bore an aura of reverence, as though it were a sanctuary untouched by the corruption of Mordheim. But I could feel it. The relic was close, its presence vibrating through the walls, drawing me forward like a promise whispered in the dark. Beside me, Karl moved with a grim determination. He said little, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. There was an energy to him, a tension that had only grown since we began this journey. Each step brought us closer to the relic, and with it, the stakes grew higher. As we neared the cathedral steps, figures began to emerge from the shadows, stepping into the moonlight. They were gaunt and robed in black, their faces hidden beneath tattered hoods. I could see the faint glint of their lifeless eyes, empty and hollow, yet filled with a twisted purpose. The scent of decay clung to them, mingling with the stale air that surrounded the cathedral. They were undead, animated by something far more sinister than the usual necromancy that plagued this city. "Cultists," Karl murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my eyes narrowing. It seems we're not the only ones drawn to the relic. One of the cultists stepped forward, raising a skeletal hand as if to halt us. His voice was a dry rasp, filled with contempt and reverence in equal measure. "Turn back, creatures of the night. The relic of redemption is not meant for those who walk in darkness." I felt a smirk tug at my lips. "And who are you to decide what is meant for me?" "We are its guardians," the cultist replied, his tone icy and unwavering. "We protect it from the unworthy, from those who would use its power to corrupt rather than redeem." "Redemption," I echoed, savoring the word, as if it held the taste of something forbidden. "Do you truly think you can stop me from claiming what is mine?" The cultist raised his head, his hollow eyes meeting mine. "We are not here to stop you, vampire. We are here to end you." With that, he raised his hands, and the other cultists surged forward, their movements mechanical yet swift, like puppets drawn by invisible strings. They came at us with a zeal I had seldom encountered, their devotion to the relic evident in the fierceness of their attacks. I didn't hesitate. My sword was in my hand, a dark blur as it cut through the first wave of cultists, their brittle bones snapping beneath the force of my blows. They fought with a determination that bordered on madness, throwing themselves at me with no regard for their own survival. They were fanatics, bound by a purpose I could almost respect, had it not stood in my way. Beside me, Karl fought with a ferocity that surprised me. He moved through the cultists with a ruthlessness I had not seen before, his strikes precise and brutal. He didn't hesitate, didn't hold back. Each swing of his blade was a death sentence, a merciless execution that left no room for mercy. I had seen Karl fight countless times, but this was different. I noticed it first in the way he struck down a cultist who was already retreating, his blade slicing through flesh and bone with a finality that left no doubt. His eyes were cold, focused, yet there was something else there. A darkness, a hunger that went beyond survival. He fought not just to clear a path, but as if driven by a personal vendetta. And as I watched him, cutting through the undead cultists with a fervor that rivaled their own, a question gnawed at the back of my mind. What was driving him to such lengths? What stake did he have in this relic, this object that promised either redemption or power? The suspicion that had lingered since we began our journey grew sharper, more insistent. Karl was hiding something. "Keep moving," he barked, shoving a cultist back with a force that sent the creature sprawling to the ground. His tone was harsh, commanding, as though he were no longer my ally but an adversary cutting through anyone in his way. I shook off the thought, refocusing on the battle at hand. The cultists were relentless, their bodies piling up around us, yet still they came, driven by a purpose that went beyond life or death. But they were no match for me. They thought their devotion would protect them, that their faith could shield them from the wrath of a vampire. They were wrong. I called upon my strength, letting the bloodlust rise within me. My vision sharpened, my senses heightened as I moved through the cultists, my blade a blur of death. I could feel their life forces ebbing, their energy fading as they fell one by one. But even as I fought, I kept one eye on Karl, watching the way he moved, the way his strikes grew more ruthless with each kill. The battle raged on, the cathedral's grounds littered with the broken bodies of its so-called guardians. But I could see the end now, the way forward clear. With the final surge, I cut down the last of the cultists, their bodies crumpling to the ground as the silence settled over us. I turned to Karl, my gaze hard and questioning. You fought well, I said, my voice cold. Perhaps too well. He met my gaze, his eyes dark and unreadable. What does that mean? I stepped closer, my grip on my sword tightening. It means I've noticed a change in you, Karl. You fight as though there's more at stake here than just survival. He held my gaze, unflinching. Is that so wrong? This relic, it could change everything. We both have something to gain from it, don't we? His words struck a chord, one I couldn't ignore. He was right, of course. This relic held power beyond anything I had encountered, a power that could either free me from this existence or elevate me above all others. But Karl's tone, the intensity in his eyes, told me there was more he wasn't saying. Just remember, I said, my voice low and dangerous, that whatever you hope to gain, I will not be crossed. He nodded, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a glint of something hidden, something dangerous. And in that moment I knew that this journey would not end as simply as I had hoped. The cultists may have fallen, but the true test had just begun. The relic lay within our reach, but so did the seeds of betrayal. Chapter 4. The darkened halls. The cathedral's interior was cloaked in shadows, its vastness stretching out before us in eerie silence. As we stepped inside, the heavy air seemed to press down on me, thick with an almost tangible weight. This was no ordinary place of worship. It was a monument to something darker, something ancient. The relic's presence pulsed within these walls, as if it had seeped into the very stones over centuries of waiting. Strange inscriptions covered the walls, twisted symbols and phrases written in a language that felt wrong even to look at. Some I could vaguely recognize as archaic warnings, others as dedications to dark powers beyond even a vampire's understanding. The sight of them filled me with an uncharacteristic unease, as though the cathedral itself were watching, judging me. But for all my centuries of power and darkness, I refused to cower before mere walls. Karl moved ahead, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hall with a focus that bordered on obsession. He seemed to be looking for something specific, something he hadn't yet spoken of. He'd stop at strange carvings, linger over statues half consumed by the shadows, his fingers trailing along stone, as if he sought to uncover secrets buried within the rock itself. "Karl," I said, my voice echoing softly against the cavernous walls. "We're here for the relic, not to admire the architecture." He glanced back at me, his face a mask of composure. "Just making sure we're not missing anything, Frich. These markings could be important, clues to understanding the relic's nature." There was logic in his words, but something about his behavior made my skin crawl. Karl had been my loyal companion for years, a soldier who served without question, yet now he moved with a purpose of his own. The way he studied each artifact, each statue, was with an interest that went beyond simple curiosity. He seemed driven, hungry for something that he wasn't sharing with me. I narrowed my eyes, my voice low. "Your interest in these symbols is commendable, Karl. But let's not waste time on things that don't matter. We're here for one purpose alone." He nodded, yet I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, an impatience, an unwillingness to submit. The doubt that had festered in me since our journey began clawed at my mind, and the shadows seemed to deepen around us as we moved deeper into the cathedral. The relic was near. I could feel it, a thrumming presence that seemed to pull me forward, each step resonating with the power hidden within these darkened halls. I could feel it reaching out to me, filling my veins with a sense of purpose, a promise of freedom, or perhaps something even greater. But Karl's footsteps echoed ahead of me, his pace quickening. He drifted further, his movements growing more impatient, his gaze darting around as though searching for something only he could see. The relic, perhaps, or something more. "Enough," I hissed, my patience finally snapping. My voice cut through the silence, sharp and commanding. "Karl, stop." He halted, his hand lingering over a stone inscription that was barely legible in the dim light. He didn't look at me, didn't even flinch, but I saw the tension in his shoulders, a resistance that felt almost defiant. "What is it, Frich?" he asked, his tone carefully controlled. I stepped closer, my gaze piercing. "You've been leading us through this place as though you know it better than I do, moving ahead without so much as a word. Do you intend to reach the relic first? He turned to me then, his expression blank, but his eyes, those told a different story. You think I'm hiding something, he replied, a hint of challenge in his voice. I've been by your side through countless battles, and this is the first time you question my loyalty. It's not loyalty I question, Karl. It's purpose. I took another step forward, letting the weight of my suspicion settle between us. What do you really want from this relic? He held my gaze, his jaw clenched tight, but he said nothing. A lesser man might have faltered, but Karl's resolve was steel, and in that silence, in his refusal to answer, I felt the truth crystallize within me. You're not just here for me, are you? I continued, my voice cold. You're here for yourself. You have your own plans for this relic. He didn't deny it. For the briefest of moments, his eyes flickered, a glint of something dark and unfathomable. Ambition, perhaps, or something deeper, something more dangerous. My intentions are my own, Frich, he said, his voice quiet, measured. But that doesn't mean I intend to betray you. I felt a chill at his words, a thread of doubt twisting tighter within me. Is that so? Because it seems to me that your loyalty has become a mask, hiding something far more treacherous. He met my gaze, unflinching, his face unreadable. Maybe this relic can be more than what we've been told, he said, his voice soft yet edged with steel. Maybe it has the power to do more than merely redeem or cure. Have you considered that, Frich? That it could be something else? I watched him closely, the cracks in our alliance widening, growing deeper. And what would you have it do, Karl? I asked, my tone icy. Give you the power to escape this life, to be free of my command. He hesitated, his silence speaking louder than any words could. And in that moment I knew. Whatever loyalty he had once felt, whatever bond had held us together, it was fraying, unraveling before me. If that's what you believe, then maybe we're both wasting our time here, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The tension between us thickened, filling the darkened halls with a silence that pressed in from every side. I could feel the cathedral's gaze upon me, watching, waiting, as though it too understood the nature of betrayal. We stood there, the relic's power humming in the distance, the promise of its influence a silent draw for both of us. The silence stretched, filled with everything unsaid, everything left unresolved. Karl broke it, his voice sharp. Whatever you may think, I'm here for the same reason you are. But if you doubt me, then maybe we should part ways. Maybe it would be best if I sought the relic alone. I stepped forward, my voice low and dangerous. Don't mistake my caution for weakness, Karl. If you're hiding something, I will uncover it. And if you think you can claim the relic for yourself, think again. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then turned away, his steps echoing down the darkened hall as he continued forward, leaving me to follow in his shadow. But I did not trust him, not anymore. Whatever he wanted from this relic, I knew one thing for certain: he would not claim it before me. And if he dared to cross me, dared to betray the bond we had shared, then I would not hesitate. This was my hunt, and in the end, I would be the one to decide who walked out of this cathedral alive. Chapter 5. The Chamber of Reflection. The chamber loomed ahead, cloaked in an eerie, unnatural glow that pulsed from the walls, casting distorted reflections upon every surface. Fragments of mirrors lined the room, each piece jagged and twisted, capturing fractured images that shimmered in the dim light. The chamber felt alive, its magic thick and suffocating, crawling beneath my skin. I could feel it, ancient and predatory, coiling around my mind like a serpent. I took a step forward, and the mirrors seemed to shift, each surface capturing a different part of me: an eye, a twisted hand, the pale, haunted face of a vampire. The reflections weren't accurate, they were distorted, twisted into shapes that barely resembled my own. And yet, as I stared, I could feel something tugging at my mind, a pull that went deeper than mere reflections. I glanced over at Karl, who was silent, his gaze fixed on a large, cracked mirror across the room. His face was pale, drawn tight with something beyond fear, something deeper, more vulnerable. He seemed lost, transfixed by the image staring back at him. "Karl," I called, my voice echoing against the mirrored walls. He didn't respond, his gaze distant, hollow. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. This place was no ordinary room. It was a trap, designed to unravel us, to strip away the layers we'd spent years building. I turned to one of the mirrors, my reflection staring back at me, twisted and wrong. My own face seemed to contort, shifting in a way that I knew was impossible. The reflection began to change, its features twisting and fading, until I no longer recognized the face staring back at me. It was a younger version of myself, human, with warm skin and a heartbeat that pulsed visibly beneath the surface. And then I saw it, the memory. The night of my transformation, the agony of it, the way the darkness seeped into my veins, swallowing me whole. I could feel the fangs piercing my neck, the rush of death and power filling me, transforming me. My reflection showed me the life I had left behind, the mortality I had once despised. The memory shifted, warping into visions of those I had killed over the centuries, faces of men and women, their eyes wide with terror, their blood staining my hands. The guilt, long buried, rose like bile in my throat, and I forced it down, fighting the surge of emotion. I had chosen this path, embraced it, and I would not be undone by memories. But then I saw another image, a vision of myself, freed from the curse of vampirism, mortal, human, alive. The weight of centuries lifted, my reflection staring back at me with a face unburdened by darkness. The temptation of it struck me, sharp and undeniable. Could this relic truly do that? Could it grant me freedom, lift the curse I had carried for so long? For a moment, I felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a longing, a hope I had not felt in centuries. But then I saw it, the darkness still lurking in my own eyes, the hunger that could never be tamed. I knew then that even if I were freed from this curse, it would only leave a void, a hunger without a vessel. I tore my gaze away, grounding myself in the present, and turned to see Karl, who was still lost in his own reflection. His face was twisted with a longing I hadn't seen before, his eyes wide with a hunger that went beyond ambition. He was staring at a vision of himself, holding the relic in his hands, no longer bound by anything or anyone. A vision of freedom, of independence from me, from the relic's influence, freedom from everything. It was then that I understood. Karl didn't want the relic to redeem himself or to share in its power. He wanted it to be free, to sever his ties to me and anyone who might try to hold him back. The loyalty he had once claimed was now a shadow, an act he had worn like armor. I could see it now, laid bare by this cursed chamber. "Karl," I said, my voice low and edged with anger. "So this is what you want. Freedom at any cost, even if it means betraying me." He flinched, tearing his gaze from the mirror, his face pale. For a moment he said nothing, his expression a mixture of shame and defiance. "I didn't betray you," he murmured, though his voice was unconvincing even to his own ears. I simply wanted more than what I was given. Can you blame me for that?" "You swore loyalty to me," I said, my voice a deadly whisper. "You have fought beside me, saved my life more times than I care to count, and now I find that loyalty was nothing but a ruse, a tool to get you closer to your own desires." He met my gaze, defiance sparking in his eyes. "And what would you do, Frich? If you saw a chance to free yourself from the chains that bind you, wouldn't you take it? Wouldn't you do whatever it took?" I felt a surge of rage, but beneath it was a sliver of understanding, a grim acknowledgement of his ambition. I knew all too well the hunger for freedom, the desire to be bound by nothing and no one. But Karl's deception, his willingness to use me, to lie to me, that was something I would not forgive. "This relic isn't just a way out for you, Karl," I said, my voice deadly calm. "It's a power beyond your understanding, a force that will consume you if you attempt to wield it alone." "Maybe," he replied, his voice low and filled with a reckless determination, "but I'd rather be consumed by it than spend the rest of my life bound to someone else's will." I stepped closer, my voice a cold hiss. "Then you will be consumed, but you will not use me to do it." We stood there, the tension between us sharp enough to cut. The chamber's magic pulsed around us, feeding off our anger, our resentment, twisting our reflections into monstrous shapes, showing us the darkest parts of ourselves. I saw my own face, twisted and warped with fury, and I knew this place would see one of us dead before it allowed us to leave. For now, Karl held his ground, but the rift between us had deepened beyond repair. Whatever bond we had shared was shattered, fractured by ambition and lies. The relic was near, its promise of burning light in the darkness, but we would reach it as enemies, not allies. The chamber seemed to hum with approval, as though it relished in our broken trust. And as I turned away from Karl, I knew that from this moment on he was no longer a companion. He was a rival, and only one of us would leave the cathedral alive. The hunt had begun anew, but this time it was for each other. Chapter 6. The Truth Unveiled. The inner sanctum lay before us, a vast, hollow chamber veiled in shadows, with a single point of light at its center. There, resting upon an ancient stone altar, was the relic, its form obscured by an otherworldly glow, neither fully silver nor gold, casting an aura that seemed to pulse with life. I felt it the moment we entered, a surge of power that hit me like a wave, filling me with equal parts dread and longing. The relic called to me, whispering promises I had dared not imagine. Redemption, power, its potential twisted around me like a dark spell, ensnaring my senses. I took a step forward, drawn by the relic's pull, but my focus was interrupted by the sound of Karl's footsteps, steady and deliberate. He moved closer, his gaze fixed not on me, but on the relic, his face set with a determination I had never seen before. "Karl," I murmured, my voice echoing softly against the stone walls. "This is what we came for. Stand by your word, and let us finish this together." He didn't respond at first. His gaze remained locked on the relic, his hand slowly moving to rest on the hilt of his sword. A chill settled over me, colder than the shadows that lined the cathedral walls. And in that silence, a dark realization crept into my mind. The vision in the chamber of reflection had not been a mere illusion. It was a prophecy, a glimpse into the ambition that burned within Karl. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost regretful, yet edged with a defiance that cut through the air. "This is where we part ways, Frich. I followed you, fought beside you, but this belongs to me. I've earned it." I turned to him, my eyes narrowing as anger simmered within me. "Earned it? You stand here because of my strength, my will. And now you dare claim the relic as your own." He stepped forward, his grip on his sword tightening. "I have endured a lifetime under others' control, forced to serve, to obey. But no more. With this relic I will answer to no one, not even you." My hands clenched, my voice laced with warning. "Karl, don't do this. Whatever power you think you will gain, it will destroy you." He laughed bitterly, a sound that echoed through the empty chamber. "Perhaps. But I would rather be destroyed on my terms than live as a slave to your ambitions." The words struck me, cutting through the bond I had thought we shared. The loyalty I had once admired, the camaraderie I had trusted, it was all a facade, a mask for his ambition. In this moment he was no longer my ally, he was a rival, a threat, and threats were meant to be eliminated. I took a step back, my hand drifting to my own weapon. "Very well," I said, my voice cold as stone. "You wish to claim the relic. Then prove yourself worthy of it." With a snarl, Karl lunged forward, his sword flashing in the dim light. I met his strike with my own, the clash of steel ringing out through the chamber like a death knell. Our blades locked, and for a moment we were face to face, each of us straining against the other, neither willing to yield. "You were nothing before me," I hissed, pressing forward, forcing him back. "A nameless mercenary, drifting through the shadows. And now you seek to take what is mine." He grunted, breaking the lock and swinging his blade in a wide arc. I dodged, barely missing the slice, and countered with a swift strike of my own. "I followed you because I believed in your strength," he spat, his voice filled with fury. "But I will not spend my life in another's shadow. I have the right to choose my own path." "Then that path ends here," I replied, my voice filled with ice. We circled each other, our eyes locked, each of us searching for a weakness, a momentary lapse. Karl's face was twisted with rage, his movements fueled by desperation and ambition. He fought with a recklessness I hadn't seen before, each strike fierce and unyielding, his determination turning him into a force of nature. But I was not so easily felled. I parried his attacks, countering each blow with calculated precision, letting his fury wear him down. Yet, even as I fought, I could feel the weight of betrayal, a hollow ache where trust had once been. I had allowed him into my world, given him purpose, and now he stood before me, a traitor wielding the blade of my own trust against me. He lunged forward, his sword aiming for my throat. I sidestepped, bringing my blade down in a swift arc that forced him to retreat. But he recovered quickly, his movements fluid and practiced. He was skilled, driven by a need that burned brighter than I had anticipated. And I realized then that this was not just a battle for power. It was a battle for freedom, a desperate man's final grasp for control over his own fate. "You think this relic will free you?" I sneered, blocking another strike. "You're nothing but a fool, Karl. This relic's power is beyond your understanding. It will consume you." He bared his teeth, his eyes filled with defiance. "I would rather die free than live in your shadow." With a roar, he attacked with renewed fury, his strikes coming faster, each one harder than the last. I could feel the strain, the weight of his desperation pressing against me. But I met his blows with equal strength, my resolve hardened by the knowledge of his betrayal. Our battle raged across the chamber, the sound of our clashing blades filling the air, each strike echoing like a heartbeat. Shadows flickered across the walls, cast by the relic's eerie glow, illuminating the bloodlust in our eyes. And in that moment, I knew that one of us would not leave this place alive. With a sudden burst of strength, I forced him back, my sword slicing through his guard. He staggered, blood dripping from a fresh wound, but his eyes remained fierce, unyielding. "This is your last chance," I said, my voice low, deadly. "Yield, and perhaps I will grant you mercy." He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "There is no mercy in you, Frich, and there is none in me." With a final, defiant cry, he charged, his sword raised high. But I was ready. I sidestepped his attack, my blade flashing as I brought it down in a swift, precise strike. He stumbled, his eyes wide with shock as the blade cut through his defenses, his body crumpling to the ground. I stood over him, my breath heavy, my sword dripping with his blood. The chamber fell silent, the relic's glow casting a soft, haunting light over his fallen form. He looked up at me, his gaze filled with a mixture of hatred and acceptance. "You were always destined to be alone, Frich," he rasped, his voice weak, but laced with defiance. "You may have power, but you'll have nothing else." I met his gaze, unflinching, the weight of his words sinking into the hollow place he had left within me. "And what did your defiance grant you, Karl?" "A broken body and a wasted life. This relic was never yours to claim." With a final, shuddering breath, he fell silent, his eyes fixed on the relic, his ambition forever unfulfilled. I turned to the altar, the relic's light reflecting in my eyes, its power thrumming like a heartbeat. It was mine now, the prize won through blood and betrayal. But as I reached for it, Karl's final words echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the cost of power. I stood alone, the chamber's silence pressing in around me, and for the first time, I felt the weight of my own isolation, the truth unveiled in the blood-stained glow of the relic. Chapter 7. The Choice. The relic's light pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm, bathing the chamber in a glow that seemed to breathe, to live. At my feet, Karl lay broken and bloodied, his defiance clinging to him like the last embers of a dying fire. His eyes, dull with pain, locked onto mine, filled not with fear, but with a hard, unyielding contempt. "You're no different from any other vampire lord," he spat, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Selfish, power-hungry, blind to anything but your own ambition." His words cut deep, laced with venom, and I felt them pierce through me, stirring something long buried. For a moment I wanted to dismiss him, to claim his words were the bitter ramblings of a defeated man. But they lingered, weaving into the silence between us, echoing in the shadows that wrapped around the chamber. I looked down at him, at the man who had once been my ally, my companion in countless battles. His betrayal had left a scar, a reminder of the fragility of loyalty. And yet, even now, even in his weakness, he dared to defy me, to judge me. I stepped away from him, my gaze drawn to the relic resting on the altar. Its light shifted, growing brighter as I approached, as if it sensed my presence, my desire. The power radiating from it was intoxicating, a force that called to me, whispering promises of everything I had ever sought. I could feel its allure winding around my mind, filling me with visions of what could be. The relic offered a choice. I could feel it, as clear as the beating of my own heart. Redemption or dominion. Freedom from the curse that had bound me for centuries, or the power to rule over all who dared to stand in my way. The possibilities unfolded before me, vivid and undeniable, and I felt my soul teeter on the edge, drawn to both paths with equal intensity. I closed my eyes, letting the visions wash over me. In one, I saw myself as I once was, mortal, human, freed from the hunger that had defined me, the darkness lifted from my soul. I would walk in the daylight, feel the warmth of the sun on my skin, live as I once had, unburdened by the weight of centuries of bloodshed. The idea was tantalizing, a taste of a life I had long since thought lost. But then I saw another vision, one darker and more consuming. I saw myself standing at the head of an army of the undead, ruling with an iron fist, my power unmatched, my name feared across the land. The world would bow to me, mortals and immortals alike, and I would be bound to nothing and no one. I would be a lord among lords, the master of all I surveyed, and the darkness that had once been my curse would become my strength. The relic pulsed again, its light growing brighter, as if urging me to decide. Redemption or power, freedom or dominance. The weight of the choice pressed down on me, pulling at every part of my being, each path calling to different pieces of my soul. Behind me, I heard Karl's voice, weak but filled with a quiet, relentless conviction. You can still walk away from this, Frich. You don't have to become what you despise. I turned, meeting his gaze, and for a brief moment, I saw something in his eyes, a glimmer of the man I had once trusted, the companion who had fought beside me without question. His betrayal had left me scarred, had stripped away the illusions I had once held, and yet, even now, he offered me a way out. What would you have me do, Karl? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Abandon everything? Embrace a life that no longer belongs to me? He held my gaze, his face etched with pain, but his eyes filled with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. I would have you be free, Frich. Free from this curse, from the darkness that binds you. Power is a chain just like any other. You have a chance to break it, to be something more. I looked away, my gaze returning to the relic. Its light pulsed again, its whispers filling my mind, calling me to make a choice. I knew that whatever I decided, it would change me, bind me to a path from which there was no return. I took a breath, the weight of the relic's power pressing down on me, the memories of centuries of darkness swirling in my mind. The faces of those I had killed, the lives I had destroyed, they haunted me, reminders of a life defined by blood and shadows. And yet, the thought of ruling, of bending the world to my will, held its own dark appeal. If I chose power, I would no longer be bound by the hunger, by the need to hide in the shadows. I would become a force beyond anything this world had ever seen. But at what cost? The silence stretched, the relic's light filling the chamber, urging me forward. My hand hovered over it, my mind torn between the promises it held, the future it offered. And in that moment, I made my choice. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the relic's surface, its power surging through me, filling me with a sense of purpose, a clarity I had never known. I felt the weight of my decision settle over me, the path I had chosen unfolding before me, each step illuminated by the relic's light. I turned to Karl, his face twisted with a mixture of horror and resignation, his defiance fading as he saw the decision reflected in my eyes. Perhaps you were right, I murmured, my voice cold as the relic's power wrapped around me. But it is too late for redemption. My path is set. And as I felt the relic's energy fuse with my own, I knew that I would walk this path alone, bound by the choice I had made, forever changed by the power I now wielded. The relic's light faded, its whispers silenced, leaving me alone in the shadows, the weight of my decision heavy upon me. I turned away, my gaze fixed on the darkness ahead, the path I had chosen stretching out before me, and with a final, unspoken farewell to the life I had left behind, I stepped forward into the night. You said, writing from the point of view of Frich Von Haas, can you write Chapter 8? The final decision, an uncertain path. In the end, Frich makes his choice, but what that choice entails is left ambiguous, allowing the readers to question his true motivations. Whether he chose redemption or power, he leaves the cathedral changed, with the relic's influence still lingering within him. Karl's fate, Frich spares Karl's life, though he leaves him behind, symbolizing the severance of their bond. Karl, defeated and humiliated, vows to seek his own path, becoming a potential enemy or rival in the future. The journey continues. Frich steps out of the cathedral and into the dark streets of Mordheim, either embracing his path to redemption or his destiny as a ruler of the undead. The city remains as treacherous as ever, but Frich is now armed with newfound purpose, and possibly the relic's power. Chapter 8. The Final Decision. The relic's power hummed within me, its influence weaving into the very core of my being. I could feel it, a presence lingering in the back of my mind, neither oppressive nor benevolent, simply there. The choice I had made had marked me irrevocably. Whether I had chosen redemption or power, it did not matter now. What mattered was the weight of that decision, settling over me like a shadow that would forever follow in my wake. I glanced down at Karl, lying battered and bloodied on the cold stone floor. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, but his eyes still held a glimmer of defiance. Even now, as he lay defeated, he clung to his pride, unwilling to yield. "Go on, Frich," he rasped, his voice filled with a bitter edge. "Take what you've claimed. Embrace whatever power you sought. You'll be alone in it, just as you deserve." I studied him in silence, my thoughts a tangled web of decisions and consequences. There had been a time when I had trusted him, when his loyalty had felt as solid as stone. But the relic had stripped away those illusions, revealing the ambition that had always simmered beneath his surface. He had seen me as a means to his own ends, an obstacle to his freedom. Perhaps he had been right about me, at least in part. I had sought this relic not only for what it could grant, but for the power it promised to reveal. Power over myself, or perhaps over others, was all intertwined in the choice I'd made. But as I looked at him, broken yet unyielding, I felt no hatred, no anger, only a sense of finality, as if the bond between us had been severed long before we entered this cathedral. This was simply the moment of acknowledgement. "I will not kill you, Karl," I said, my voice calm, steady. "Not because I owe you anything, but because the path you seek is yours to walk, as is the fate that comes with it." He stared at me, his expression flickering between surprise and contempt. "You think sparing me makes you noble, that it absolves you?" "No," I replied simply. "It is simply what must be done. Go, if you still have the strength. Forge your own path, if that's what you seek. But know this, if you cross me again, mercy will not come twice." A shadow of understanding passed through his eyes, mingling with resentment and something deeper, perhaps regret. He nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible gesture, and slowly dragged himself to his feet, his gaze locked on mine. Whatever we had once shared was gone, replaced by a gulf too vast to bridge. He would be a rival, an adversary perhaps, but that, too, was part of the path we had chosen. Without another word, I turned and made my way toward the entrance of the cathedral, leaving him behind. I could feel his gaze on my back, a final weight, an acknowledgement of what had been and what would never be again. The relic's power still pulsed within me as I stepped out into the night, the city of Mordheim stretching out before me in its ruinous glory. The streets were quiet, shrouded in shadow, but I could sense the life that pulsed within them, the souls drawn to this cursed place as if by some dark force. It was a place of power, of ambition and decay, where creatures like me could rise or fall, consumed by the very darkness they sought to master. I had come here seeking a relic, a way to redefine myself, and in many ways I had found it. Whether that path led to redemption or rule, I could not yet say. All I knew was that the choice had bound me to something greater, something that would drive me forward into the shadows and beyond. As I walked into the city, the relic's influence whispered to me, filling me with a sense of purpose. It was a silent promise, a reminder that whatever I had chosen, I was no longer the vampire I had once been. The relic's power had marked me, reshaping me in ways I could barely comprehend, a force that would guide my steps or haunt them, perhaps both. Mordheim stretched out before me, a city that had devoured countless souls, yet still hungered for more, and I would walk its streets as both predator and prey, bound to this path I had chosen, carrying the weight of the relic's power within me.